most recently, we are delighted, although perhaps not quite as delighted as she was, that she was awarded winner of Architect of the Year at the Women in Construction Awards. You see how I said the words really slowly to make sure they clapped? That was good. That was good. We're absolutely delighted that she's agreed to join us this evening to tell us about her work. Simone de Gale.
Thank you very much to the Stephen Lawrence Trust for inviting me to speak tonight. It is a real privilege and honor, and I'm very pleased to be able to share my work with you. So, resilience. I've looked up the definition of resilience, and it means the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties and toughness, and the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape and elasticity. Resilience in architectural study. The route to becoming a qualified architect is 8 years in minimum, and throughout this you are taught to be resilient within your designs. As a person, you build a character of resilience, and it serves very well when you enter into practice. So I want to speak to you about a project that we're working on and the resilience that we have sought through that. So the site is located in Georgia, in East Europe, and it is 160,000 square meters of empty space. We have some rudimentary buildings on there at the moment. The site is owned by the Omega Group, and we're very fortunate tonight to have our client, the president of the Omega Group, Mr. Zaza Okwashili, here to view our keynote speech. So here are some photographs of the site. Georgia used to be part of the Soviet Union, and at that time there were some structures that were built onto this site, but it never actually became what the intention was. Georgia is now independent, and this is the site as it is today. So we had to come up with a concept for this project, and our brief was simply to have a mixed-use development scheme which would maximize a residential opportunity. So we looked at the planning legislation in Georgia, and there's a number of categories, as we have here in the UK, and we looked at the opportunity to build a public business zone whereby we could allocate 60% of the site to one particular use, but not more than that. And within that 60%, we would allocate the residential development, and we would have 40% as a retail park. And we would utilize the existing structures so that we could create that. So in total, for the residential, that meant it would be 96,000 square meters, and in effect, using the formulas that were granted to us, we could create 336,000 square meters of residential space, and we felt that this was a good starting point so that we could ensure that our client was satisfied with our proposal. So to build a concept for this project, what I was really keen on was that we visited the Omega Group's factories in Georgia when we visited there in Tbilisi. Our client is one of the largest manufacturing firms in Georgia, and I was really, really impressed by their factories. They're beautiful. All of their machinery was placed in such a well thought through process. Everything was very clean, although it had been built maybe 20 years ago, and not a piece of dust in sight. And I just knew that the company ethos was to have this repetition, this sort of well thought through process and style, and I was really keen to build the concept around the company ethos. So to expand on that, we started to look at artists in Georgia, and one of the prominent artists is Alexander Berdyshev, and we started to look at his abstract work, his style, where I could recognize, a repetitive nature, something that could be used as a pattern, and I thought that this was very good. We also visited the museum when we were in Georgia, and again we looked at the history of the jury, etc. And I started to pick up again these sort of patterns, and I started to think that we were headed in the right direction. So I thought, okay, well, let's look at some classical architectural rules of repetition, rhythm and pattern in architecture. Let's get some precedent, and let's start to develop this proposal. And I started to look at some precedent studies, as well as then expanding on that, started to look at architectural grids around the world. Of course, the famous Barcelona grids, New York, and also San Francisco. And, I thought that this would be really, really good if we could achieve something of a similar nature for this project. So we went back to the site, and I thought that we should take a block. You can see this is a simple square, and start to look at that in different ways so that we could create a building block which we could repeat across the site. So initially we started with the U shape with a courtyard in the center, and we started to build an infrastructure around that and started to repeat it across the site on the plan. Then started to look at building heights, and I thought that there could be two ways we could develop the heights. And the first way would be to have a uniform height across the site, and then the second would be to have a varied height across, which obviously would create a more sort of intricate and elegant pattern. So we applied this to the site, and as you can see, initially we had a uniform height all across the site, and in terms of the residential area, that is the 60%, and then we had the three existing buildings, which would become part of the retail park. So the retail park, 40% of the site. What I thought would be really nice is take these existing buildings. One of these, the largest one actually, is 11,000 square meters in its footprint, and I thought, and it's in good shape. It's been recladded already, and I thought it would be good if we could use this as a shopping centre. But the other two buildings need refurbishment, but I thought it would be really nice if we could create this beautiful rectangle for the retail park. So in doing so, putting 3 new buildings in there, and then having this wonderful green space all around the retail park where, we could create a sort of Hyde Park area where we could have, lakes and statues and horse riding and these sorts of things. And I thought that, this would be really good. So for the retail area, we could reclad the existing building, the shop, to create a shopping centre. We could have a supermarket, a very big supermarket, and then office administration facilities, as well as having, with the new buildings, the cinema and a casino at night, because casino is quite popular in Georgia. And then we could have logistics and plant facilities. So we created a infrastructure improvement, new connections to the existing roads. And of course, this would allow people to move through the site to get access to the shopping centre, for residents to get access to homes. And we created 2 new connections on the west side also. As well as having on-street parking, there was an opportunity to have underground parking, particularly for the retail area, and so this is what we proposed. So in total, the development would become, in effect, approximately 504,000 square meters of new development, and this is presented to our client. So here we had the vision of what the development would become. You can see that we've cladded the buildings in the retail areas, and we have something quite new and innovative for the office and administration, so that is quite appealing in terms of landmark and being able to recognize the site. And then we had this repeatable pattern for the residential buildings, and at that time I thought that it would be really nice if we went for a uniform height across the residential area, because it would reinforce that sort of strength that we witnessed from our client in terms of the way that they run their manufacturing firm. So I'm going to speak about how we presented this proposal, and it was liked. Our client was very happy, and we all felt that we were moving in the right direction. But once we did present this, our client wanted to see some improvements. He had his own ideas, and so we started to incorporate that. So first of all, he wanted to see a larger footprint in the block, and he wanted to see more green spaces within the residential areas. And so this is what we provided. We thought that, you know, this was could be accommodated, and also that it was a very good idea. And then after that, our client wanted to see more retail areas, retail and commercial within the residential spaces, and this was so that we could provide facilities such as local grocery stores, post office, banks, day-to-day requirements, so that residents would not have to travel so far into the shopping centre to get their amenities. And this was fine, we could incorporate that. We then presented our plans to a local planning consultant, someone who works for the Tbilisi City Hall, and he wasn't that happy that all of our buildings were uniform in height, and he wasn't that happy that all of the buildings were the same shape as well. This is particularly in the residential area, because the retail zone, everyone was pretty much happy with that. So we then changed the plan and started to have different heights, varied heights in buildings. We had different shapes of the buildings, and what I thought was really important is that we continue to have this this continuity of repetition, pattern, and mirroring throughout the master plan. And so we presented this to our client and to the planning consultant, and it was likened, the design was likened, but our client came back to us and said, you know, that although this is a nice design, he was not happy that the buildings, the residential buildings, which were initially 900 square meters in this building footprint, started to be 3 times as much in its building footprint. And so what that meant is that to build one of these buildings would cost maybe 3 times as much as than the previous design. And so this is a phased project, this is a phased program, and it will be built part by part. So we had to go back and revisit the size of the buildings. So we went back to this original square that we had, but then we continued to have this varied height throughout the master plan. And this was a proposal that we developed for some time. Our client was quite happy, we were happy. You know, we had this elegance in the master plan in terms of going from tall buildings down to low and then back up. And also we continue to have our rules in terms of the repetition, in terms of the the mirroring and the symmetry throughout the master plan, but then we satisfied the planning consultant by having this variety of buildings throughout the plan. So, you know, we developed this for some time and all parties were quite happy. But then we presented the design to some internal planning officers, and I believe it's 4 in total, who are actually going to be making a decision on this master plan. And they were adamant that although we had followed planning legislation in terms of distances, heights, etc., they were adamant that they wanted more of a distance between the buildings, the residential buildings. And we actually had to accommodate 20 meters between each building as a minimum, when previously some of the buildings were less than that. And so I thought that, you know, it was started to become quite testing and it was quite challenging, because if we started to have wider distances between the buildings, then that meant that we would either have to reduce the size of the block, each block, from the 900 square meters to something less. And if we did that, then it meant that the buildings would have to become taller to accommodate our ideal 336,000 square meters. Or the buildings would remain the same size, and then we would have less buildings, but then we'd still be in quite a difficulty there. But this is what was required, because the planning officers would be the officers making the decision on whether we could build this master plan or not. So we did accommodate the 20 meters, and what did happen is that the building started to become slightly taller, because I wanted to retain a certain number on the site, which worked with our planning program as well. So we accommodated the 20 meters, and this is the master plan as it is today. Excuse me. This is the master plan as it is today, and what we have done is we've reduced the width of the buildings. We have 24 meters square, but then the buildings have started to become taller as you get to the site boundary. So this is the vision as it is at the moment, and I mean, generally I'm quite happy with it, but I feel myself that the buildings, the residential blocks towards the edge of the site, I think at the moment they're still a little bit too tall. I'm quite happy with the buildings towards the centre, which are creating the boulevard. I'm happy with the retail park, but I think that there's still some aspects that we need to rejig to make sure that this is, that it has more grace as a master plan than what it currently has. But it is a good proposal nonetheless, and our client is happy. So to summarize, I want to let you know that being an architect means that you are a resilient person. I think to study architecture, you actually have to be quite resilient in itself, and it is a long process, and to get through that process takes time, and it takes courage and determination. And then when you actually go into practice, you have to practice resilience every day. As architects, you create these, you know, these beautiful ideas, these beautiful concepts, proposals, and, you know, as a designer, you want to see them being built. But to have your projects being built means that you have to go through different processes. You have to go through planning, which means that you have to start to look at other people's opinions on your buildings, and those opinions you might not always like, but ultimately sometimes these are opinions which are going to have an impact because it is something that is maybe preferred in that area or for that city. You also, as your designs, you have to have a compliance with building regulations and health and safety legislation, because people are going to live in your buildings, they're going to work there, and your buildings have to comply with being able to accommodate people. Beyond that, You then have to be resilient in terms of your ideas, you know, who's going to pay for these projects, what are the costs going to be, what materials are you going to use, and you have to be quite sensible about that, because you can create something quite stunning, but you have to be sensible with the costings, because ultimately, from my experience, you know, there needs to be a good return on that investment, and a client needs to be able to see that. And then further still, I think that the idea of understanding that there is a timing to your projects is very important, because architectural projects can take some time to be designed and then to be built as well. And you have to be quite rigorous with your plan. You have to be quite determined and on point so that you can keep the project alive. It's quite easy for them to sometimes be stagnated. And I think with a determination, you can ensure that your projects are built. So I think that if you are looking to become an architect, and if you are an architect, you probably understand the resilience that you have been built within you. And if you're studying, then I would encourage you to keep going on.